There's the cats on the door. Can you hear that?
That's going in the pod.
Which one is it? It's Roscoe! Yes, where was I? Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, a weekly motorsport podcast brought to you by the team behind Motorsport Monday and motorsportweek.com. My name's Dan Lawrence, and joining me is Motorsport Monday and motorsportweek.com editor Taylor Powling, and we're here to discuss the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, which took place last weekend, again on a Saturday. It was another Red Bull domination, but Ollie Bearman stole the headlines with his sparkling debut. But first, Taylor, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Dan. How are you?
I am good. Buoyed by Bearman's fun performance in his fun performance in Saudi Arabia sort of helped steer the narrative away from Red Bull's off-track shenanigans and their on-track domination. But should we start with the Bulls and how they romped away and nobody could catch them again?
Yes. Charles Leclerc managed to split them on the grid, but once again it was that 3/10 gap between Verstappen and Leclerc. Verstappen aced his lap. You could see on the onboard he was right up against the barriers. That was man and machine in perfect harmony. He couldn't improve on his second run. His first run was that good. And it kind of stepped the stall out for how the race was going to go. We kind of all expected, provided that Max got off the line well. And he had a bit of a tardy start, but able to hold the inside line in turn one. Behind him, Leclerc and Perez to battle. But yeah, he was just formidable all weekend. Verstappen looks unbeatable. The Red Bull car looks unbeatable. And I'm sure they'll be racking up many 1-2s this season, depending on how Perez's form goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Perez did the sort of perfect number 2 driver job. He managed to get into second. He absorbed the sort of effects of the 5-second time penalty he was given, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit, and just put in the laps to stay comfortably ahead. And I think, being in a place where if Perez is doing fine, then they're clear of everyone. It's a bit worrying for everybody else. Charles Leclerc said he was worried about, obviously, his tyre warm-up, something that plagued him in Q3 again for the second week in a row, and it plagued him sort of at the start and also after the safety car restart as well, having to fight through the pack. But yes, Perez got himself a little penalty, which made his job a little bit harder. It was an interesting one, unsafe pit stop release, which he then admitted after the race was his fault.
Yeah, so I think he said the steward said that the red light was on, but he kind of just went because he thought it was clear, and then it turns out that it wasn't clear because Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin was coming along in the fast lane. Bit of a weird one. It obviously didn't cost him in the end because the Red Bull was so superior that he quickly got Leclerc, who was tucked up behind Hamilton and Norris for a few laps. Yeah, I mean, it was not the type of incident you want to be picking up penalty points for, especially when you're on the brink of closing on a race ban. Perez is only 4 points away from getting the 12 in a calendar year or a 12-month period that would receive a driver ban. And he's got about 15 rounds now until Singapore when his points do begin to come down. So he's got to walk a tight line to avoid getting a race ban. So we could, aside from Ollie Bearman, we could see Liam Lawson getting a standard appearance in a top team this season at some point.
Yes, he's got to be on his best behaviour. But yes, stand-ins. Ollie Bearman, 18 years old, the youngest Ferrari driver ever, the third youngest Grand Prix debut driver ever, and he did really rather well. Obviously, he sort of got his chance with Ferrari in sad circumstances because Carlos Sainz suffering with appendicitis and needed to go to the hospital, but because he's fit as a fiddle, once he had his operation, he was straight back in the paddock walking around on Saturday, which was quite remarkable. But yeah, so Bearman got called up at the start of FP3, in Jeddah of all places, probably one of the trickiest tracks on the calendar. Vasseur said it killed his F2 weekend because obviously he was on pole and still doesn't have any points in Formula 2 after Prema's terrible weekend in Bahrain. But in Formula 1, Bearman did very, very well, didn't he?
He did. He did very, very well. It's testament to him that you wouldn't have known he was a rookie if you were new to the sport and didn't know the circumstances around his debut. Absolutely faultless. Was unfortunate not to make Q3, but I think considering the circumstances, nobody expected him to anyway. I mean, I touched on it in a tweet I did. Q1 these days is usually covered by about 1 second. And considering he was jumping in with 1 hour of practice, and people forget, it wasn't just 1 hour of practice, it was 1 hour of unrepresentative practice. It was in daytime conditions, whereas qualifying was at night. and from the most challenging circuits on the calendar, as you said, 27 turns, high speed, mistakes are punished. There's no room for error at the Jeddah Corniche circuit. But Bearman didn't put a foot wrong. I mean, fighting through the traffic, it would have been easy for him to be impatient, but he had a bit of a remark about Hulkenberg being slow. After the race, he admitted that the energy deployment, that was one area where more experienced drivers like Hulkenberg were more attuned to than he was. Yeah, when you look at a driver like Lance Stroll, who I'm sure we'll get onto later, he made a critical error that put him out the race and actually helped Bearman because that's how he got ahead of Norris and Hamilton with the safety car. Um, it would have been so easy for Bearman to, like, if he'd have made that sort of mistake, you'd have forgiven him for it because Stroll turned in at turn 22, clipped the barrier, and he went straight on. That would have been such an easy mistake for Bearman to do, but he didn't.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah, Bearman drove a sort of faultless race in a way. There weren't any mistakes on his side. He obviously, he had that scruffy Q2, which meant that he had to put it all on the line for that final lap, and it meant he only just missed out on Q3, which was remarkable. But Stroll, how many years is it now? It's quite a few, and he's supposedly meant to be the future of that team, some say, particularly his father. And Fernando Alonso when he's singing from the Aston Martin hymn sheet. But that was a very rookie error. The one thing I did really enjoy about that, though, is when he was in the barrier and we heard the team radio with the engineer going, "Can you bring it back?" And Stroll had an expletive riddle to reply. He was like, "No, because I'm in the fudging barrier." I think were the words he used, or words to that effect. But Bearman, yeah, you say obviously with the sort of the energy deployment, that was the thing I found really remarkable about his race is that he had cars which were slower than the Ferrari to pass Sonoda and Hulkenberg and cars like that, Joe in the Sauber, which is very slow. But he took his time, one obviously because he was trying to suss out the energy deployment, but a sort of a rookie driver, you'd expect maybe they would rush those decisions or make mistakes because they don't understand the deployment. But he took the time to understand what he was doing in the car and he picked his moments carefully, which I thought was probably the most impressive part of his performance. And then in the final stint after Norris and Hamilton, who of course elected to stay out in the safety car, and then they went on for that little short soft tyre run at the end, they couldn't breach the gap to him. I mean, one, I think Norris and Hamilton both said that the soft tyres peaked after like 2 laps. But 2, Bearman was able to sort of manage that 3-second gap really effectively, I thought, at the end, again, which was equally impressive. And everybody seems to agree in the paddock. Everybody was very glowing in their reviews of him. And now it's a question of when is he going to get a drive full time. It seems like he could be the Formula 2 driver to break the curse. That seems to be happening, where drivers aren't getting Formula 1 drives, but mainly that's due to them not being perhaps ready. It looks like Bearman certainly is, based on this one sort of set of data, but he's got 6 practice sessions with Haas, hasn't he? And he'll be testing in the F175. Where would you see him going? Is it just he's going to have to, ply his trade in a Haas in 2025? But then that means they have to get rid of one of their experienced drivers.
Yeah, I think that's the only option really on the table for Bearman. I mean, you look at, he's not going to jump straight into the main Ferrari seat unless somehow they decided to cancel Lewis Hamilton's contract, which, yeah, doesn't seem likely in the slightest. And then you look at Ferrari's customers. You've got Sauber. They're transitioning into Audi. We had the news over the weekend that Audi will take 100% majority in that team. So there'd be no point in Sauber fielding a Ferrari Junior for 1 year before Audi then take over the reins. So that only does leave Haas, and you must say Magnussen must be looking over his shoulder. Haas are very impressive Bearman. Ayu Komatsu has spoken about him after FP1 in Mexico last year, how quickly he adapted, and again after this weekend he was asked, and yeah, very impressive. So Magnussen's probably the one because Hulkenberg does seem to have the edge at Haas, but showings like Magnussen's in Saudi, although was a bit scruffy and he didn't deliver the point, he played his role in the team game, and we know Haas do in their position. They like to plump for experience because they are an inexperienced team in their own right.
Yeah, but I think I'd say you're right. If they had to get rid of a driver, it probably would be Magnussen. Basically, I think mainly based on Hulkenberg's qualifying performances, he puts Haas in a better position starting on Sundays to try and extract something from the race. But Magnussen did do a very good job of defending after racking up his 20 seconds worth of penalties for being himself, really. The incident with Albon chopping off his front wing end plate, and then the other one was for gaining an advantage, wasn't it, off track?
Yes, so he overtook Sonoda, I think it was at turn 4. Yes, so that really riled RB up. They're wanting to speak to the FIA about it. They think it's unsportsmanlike behaviour because Magnussen was literally circulating at about 1.5 to 2 seconds off the pace. And then as soon as Hulkenberg came out ahead of him, miraculously Magnussen was on the same pace as Hulkenberg. So, yeah, tactics at hand there from Haas.
Yes, and remarkably absorbed that 20-second penalty quite well.
Yes, and it also became null and void because he ended up classified 12th where he was because he was the last driver not to go a lap down. So technically it didn't cost him anything, which is a bit, yeah. From that point of view, I could see why there's an argument about the rules being a bit unfair. But in terms of RB's complaint that it's unsportsmanlike and it costing Sonoda, well, it's on the other cars to overtake Magnussen. He's doing his job for the team. If he's going so slow, those other cars should try and overtake him, but they didn't. So,
to speak to a worry of sort of how easy it is to overtake, it is getting more difficult to follow now. Saudi's not a great place to pass anyway, just because it's just a constant high-speed corner after high-speed corner. So if you want to try a lunge, you're basically going to end up in an ungodly accident. It's only really the DRS zone, either trying a move into the final corner and then hanging on with energy deployment for the second DRS zone just afterwards, or just making that move into turn 1, which is what most people were doing. You saw Albon trying some outside moves on the bank curve, which never came off. It's not the best place to pass.
I did notice this year, whereas in previous years at Jeddah, we've kind of had a cat and mouse effect where you've had drivers like have battled into that final corner with the DRS and then obviously continue to turn 1. But this year there were so few battles and it was mainly action on the brakes. We saw Albon, as you said, he admitted that Williams don't have that straight line speed advantage they had last year, so he was having to rely on making moves on the brakes. So yeah, it did seem there was less action than previous years at Jeddah, and I think that does come down to the dirty air effect that a lot of drivers are saying it's getting back towards 2021 levels before this generation of ground effect cars came into effect.
Which is another worrying thought, really, in terms of exciting races moving forward. But yeah, I think back on Bearman again with Haas, is that it's not the best team. I mean, they look like they've made a good step under Ayakomatsu, but there's still the issues of how that team is structured, how that team is owned. But for a young driver, it's not the best scenario. But then you could look from Bearman's perspective. Ferrari obviously very much are keen on him. Lewis Hamilton has signed an initial 2-year deal with Ferrari. And we're hypothesizing. I'm going to use a shorter word that I can actually say. We're looking very far ahead into the future. But Bearman, a couple of years at Haas, Hamilton then retires, then you've easily got your Ferrari replacement if all goes well and good. I guess the only other option for Bearman would be for Ferrari to let him go to a Williams, to a Mercedes even with an empty seat, or to the Sauber Audi project.
You also don't get teams wanting to take loan options anymore, do you? Why would when it's so competitive and you've got kind of this franchise model, why would you want to develop and nurture another team's driver at the end of the day for their benefit? So yeah, it kind of looks like hassle bust for Bearman. It's a shame that he doesn't have. When Leclerc came into the sport, he had that Fred Vasseur managed Sauber team, and that was such a perfect fit for him. He was able to alongside each other, they kind of developed through the season, and it was a really good relationship, benefited both parties massively. Bearman's not in that privileged position. But yeah, we'll have to see because Komatsu does seem like a good leader.
Yeah.
Speaks very well. So yeah, and also Bearman, like Leclerc did when he kind of graduated into F1, he had that relationship with Ferrari's customer teams, and Bearman has spoken about this year those 6 FP1s being a chance to build that relationship with Haas, and I think it's quite telling that he's been given 6 FP1s because that is quite a large number. That's a quarter of the calendar. So I do think Bearman's in Haas's plans, at least for 2025.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for rookies to get into Formula One anyway. And yeah, you say with the 6 practice sessions, it's the minimum of 2 that the teams have to fill out in terms of a young driver in those FP1 sessions. And you saw last year, they all just sort of rushed and did them at the end of the year because I don't think any of the teams really didn't really care about doing it because I don't think there was much interest.
They took them at the most unrepresentative sessions. You have Mexico FP1 where it's just dusty and you don't get much data, and then Abu
Yeah,
Dhabi where it's daytime and the race is run in twilight conditions. So yeah,
and it's the end of the year, so we're all done and dusted. I think the Felipe Drogovic's, the Jack Dillons, it speaks to their likelihood of getting chances that Bearman's been given 6 practice sessions with his setup, whereas that's not really being afforded to these guys. Sargent is another one. I think we were both surprised Sargent kept his job for 2024. He doesn't, I mean, it's only 2 rounds, but he doesn't look to have made a step. He still looks to be fairly inconsistent, I would say. Yeah, so I could see another seat opening up there, but I mean, we're judging Sargent against Bearman. Bearman's just had 1 race where he's exceeded expectations, but I feel like Bearman's performance makes Sargent's position look worse.
yeah, 100%. I mean, Sargent, he's been out in Q1 in both Bahrain and Saudi. I think Bahrain there was an actual technical problem there which stopped him from having his second run in Q1. Um, but yeah, this weekend because he was actually last year he started the season really strongly in Saudi. He should have qualified Albon if it wasn't for that infraction with the pit line. I think it was on his Q1 lap. But yeah, this weekend it's kind of hard to gauge where he was at this weekend because he was running parallel with Albon. He finished 4 places behind him, but considering like the train that Magnussen had behind him, it was effectively just a gaggle of cars separated by a few seconds. So we didn't really get an assessment of where Sargent was in race trim compared to Albon when they both bottled up behind the slower moving Haas. But yeah, it's not looking good for Sargent that he's had 2 Q1 exits so far, and talking of Bearman, depending on how his teammate in F2 gets on, that could be the seat that goes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll quickly touch on Bearman's Prema teammate Antonelli. Obviously, he's had a lot of attention on him because he's jumped Formula 3 to go straight into Formula 2. He's Mercedes junior. Everybody's saying he's Hamilton's replacement already. It was interesting watching him in Jeddah in the Formula 2 races. Obviously, you couldn't really gauge what he was doing in Bahrain because Prema was just terrible in Bahrain, but they had a more competitive car. Bearman had qualified on pole before calling up to Formula 1. Antonelli, you can tell he's got speed, but he had eventful races, let's say. There was a lot of trying moves, escaping to the runoff, just genuinely sort of being a bit rash in his decision making. He's not great with starts yet. He needs to sort of get those nailed. So he's got the talent. He's not the finished product. That I think if, for example, if Antonelli had been in the Ferrari this weekend, it would have been interesting.
Yeah, probably would have tried a rash move on Hulkenberg at some stage and ended up with them both out of the race.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see what they do with him. I think maybe a year in Williams would do him good. But should we talk about Formula One some more?
Yeah, I think it'd be a good time to talk of Antonelli and that Mercedes seat if we kind of pivot back towards the front of the grid and look at kind of the Mercedes McLaren battle. So you had Leclerc third, he was a distant third. Then you had Piastri fourth for McLaren, Alonso fifth for Aston Martin. We'll touch on Aston Martin shortly, I suspect. And then you had George Russell in the Mercedes, and coming behind Bearman, you had Norris in the McLaren and Hamilton in the Mercedes. Mercedes had a bit of a shocking weekend.
Mercedes sort of have their rallying cry at Abu Dhabi. They did it at the end of 2022 when they were like, "Oh, this year's now done. Look at us next year." And then last year started terribly. Abu Dhabi 2023. Oh, look at what we'll do next year. I mean, it started better essentially I think they've got a car which is less problematic to drive, but it's just not quick. Again, they're having these simulation issues where the simulator is telling them that they're going to be fast, and then they get on the track and they're not. High speed corners, Hamilton was complaining, wasn't he? He couldn't really keep pace. They looked fourth best. Yeah, Hamilton looks like he's ready to pack his bags and go to Maranello already, to be honest.
I mean, I wouldn't blame him. It looks like at this stage, although Ferrari aren't close to winning races because of Red Bull's dominance, it looks like he's made a timely decision like he did when he left McLaren for Mercedes. Um, Yeah, I mean, after 2022, you kind of got the feeling it's still it's still the same core that won 8 consecutive championships. It's just an off season, and for me, I still had that feeling after 2023. It's like okay, they've had two poor seasons with the ground effect cars, and that was also hampered by retaining the zero pod concept at the start of last year. With a clean slate, I thought we'd see a good fight from Mercedes to be second best this year, but they just look nowhere. The car, as you said, in high speed, and Toto Wolff saying that they have correlation issues between the simulator and the track, particularly in high speed corners. They're not getting the load that they're being shown on their simulations. That is really concerning because whereas Ferrari have a base, the car's doing everything they expect it to. They can now focus on just piling performance on and making incremental gains that close on Red Bull. Mercedes aren't in that position, although they've talked about having a better platform to build from this year, a more compliant car. If you've got a car that's not delivering what you're expecting it to, you've then got to problem solve that. And because you don't want to bring upgrades from the simulations saying you're going to have this much performance, and then those undeliver as well. So not only are they at a disadvantage where they don't have a strong base as some of their rivals, they're also at a point where these rivals are going to be focusing on performance while Mercedes is trying to problem solve.
In Ferrari's case as well, they had a sort of a volatile car last year that had inherently sort of quick. It had pace in there, and they've tamed the beast and they've sort of retained pace, whereas Mercedes have tamed a beast in a way, but there's no pace, and yeah, there's no outlook really for them to vault up the grid. And I think again, like you said, the concerning thing with the simulations, this is Mercedes, 8-time constructors champions. This is one of the biggest teams. The fact that they've got their simulations are sort of letting them down is alarming because you'd expect a bigger team to be able to nail those sort of things. So yeah, concerning times for the team in Brackley.
I mean, they solved their straight line speed. I mean, they were rapid down the straights. I mean, that might have been helped from a visual perspective that McLaren were shockingly slow on the straights this weekend. They had absolutely no straight line speed. Stella thinks it's a DRS issue more than a straight line speed issue. But yeah, whether it's a case of they've got too much drag, who knows? I guess we'll see in the coming rounds how much it plagues them. But yeah, Hamilton would be right behind Norris at the end of the DRS zone, down the start finish straight. And then you go through the high speed sweeps in sector one, and he'd lost a second. Fair enough, McLaren, we know their high speed performance is very, very good. Last year, they were the second best to Red Bull in that area. But still, to lose a second to the team you're fighting through a series of corners is really concerning. And as I say, they've solved last year and the year before, they were quite draggy on the straights. They would shed a lot of performance. They've kind of got on top of that. Their slow speed performance actually looks quite promising. So maybe somewhere like Monaco, Mercedes could be in line for a strong result there. But there seems to be that cure in one issue, and then another one develops. And Russell said they don't really have the answers, which yeah, again, is concerning.
Yeah, that seems to be the case for everybody apart from Red Bull. Red Bull have this complete package that they know what they're doing with it. There doesn't seem to be too many faults, whereas everybody else has got, like, as you say, these little problems. Like Ferrari now just have a sort of a tyre warm up issue, a sort of general pace disadvantage to Red Bull. Aston Martin race pace issues. You had the McLaren slow in a straight line. You've got, but they're fast in the corners. Mercedes the inverse. It led for that really funny battle, I thought, with Piastri and Hamilton. Piastri just couldn't get past Hamilton because the McLaren was so slow down the straight. And then it doesn't really matter if you're faster in the high speed, you can't stick a move on those corners. So it wasn't until Hamilton pitted eventually that Piastri was released to go on his run P4.
Yeah, I mean, Oscar Piastri said it best, really. Qualifying was the differentiator between McLaren and Mercedes. He said if his battle with Hamilton, as he said, he had 2 or 3 attempts around the outside of turn one where he went off the track. If he had qualified behind the Mercedes and George Russell, let's not forget, he should have qualified in the top 3 or 4. He said he had a good first run on used tyres and made a mistake in sector one on new tyres, which put him down to the 4th row just ahead of Hamilton. If Mercedes had got ahead of McLaren, as we saw with the battle there, McLaren would have struggled to get past them. So Piastri put in that lap to get ahead of them, and Norris. Obviously, Norris was a bit unfortunate with the safety car and McLaren splitting strategy. Um, it does seem like a really close battle between McLaren and Mercedes. I think it will be track dependent. They're both a bit behind Ferrari. So yeah, McLaren have got work to do, but it's a better base than they had 12 months ago, and I'm sure they've got developments coming.
Yeah, and I think they proved last year that they have a greater understanding about how to improve the car, basically. Whereas Mercedes still seem to be struggling with that. I think the technical team at McLaren identified their issues and they rectify them pretty quickly. But we're now in the fine margins, aren't we? McLaren made that big leap. They're now looking for, I mean, Ferrari as well. They're all looking for these tiny little margins, which I guess are much harder to gauge, much harder to sort of construct and add onto the car. Um, yes, Alonso and Aston Martin as well. Another sort of anonymous race. A little bit better, obviously, this time around than it was in Bahrain for him. I guess they're still. Well, you could argue that they were quicker than Mercedes this weekend. Alonso starred and practiced pretty well. We thought maybe he could be a candidate for pole position until that was sort of dashed. What did you make of? We'll just talk about Alonso's side of the garage. We've covered Stroll. What did you make of Alonso and Aston Martin's performance?
Yeah, it does seem like I think they're still fifth best team. Alonso did a great job. It's like Piastri mentions I've touched on. Qualifying performance was a big factor this weekend. After the safety car restart, Alonso was concerned about the tyres lasting 43 odd laps. I think it was at the end. He was asking about Plan B. Um, he had George Russell tucked up behind him for most of that second stint, but it was so difficult to pass that eventually kind of broke Russell's resolve and the company took a P5. He still thinks they're lacking 2 to 3 tenths on race pace, so that it's a strange one because last year it was their race pace that was superior to their qualifying. They wouldn't necessarily qualify as well as the likes of Ferrari, but race pace wise, they were definitely a threat. Whereas this it seems to be the opposite. So it's just about getting on top of why that is and addressing that. We have touched on Stroll, but going back to it, you look at the Constructors' Championship and Aston Martin are fifth, behind both Mercedes and McLaren and then Ferrari. If you had a driver operating at Alonso's level, then there's no reason why Aston Martin couldn't get third. If they had two drivers operating at a level like Alonso is, they could easily pit both McLaren and Mercedes this year. But the problem is they're basically fighting with one hand tied behind their back.
That was the same thing that happened to them last year. I think the differential between Stroll and Alonso cost Aston Martin dearly in terms of the constructors. And you've got to think, at what point does Lawrence Stroll make a decision on this regarding his driver lineup? Because they've got Honda coming in 2026 as a sort of works engine partner. Are Honda going to want to see one driver holding the team back when they could be achieving greater and bigger things? I mean, Honda are used to success in Formula One thanks to their partnership with Red Bull. So it'd be interesting to see what goes on there between the two Strolls, whether Lawrence has a conversation with his son sooner or later to maybe put him into the hypercar Valkyrie project next year or the year after. I think he's on a rolling contract, isn't he, Lance?
Yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. You'll be hard pressed to find someone who can match Fernando Alonso in the same car. You've got one handful of drivers on that you could probably say could do that. But you look at the market, Carlos Sainz is available. Mercedes, they look like they're eyeing either Antonelli or maybe even a move for Alonso. We don't really know. But if Sainz is an option for Mercedes, he he'd be unwise to go to Sauber when they're in the state they are. I'll get onto that later. Sainz is available. And Alonso Sainz partnership, that is bordering one of the best in F1. And that would elevate that team's performance standards so high. And that's what you need in this era because you've got, okay, fair enough, Red Bull, Verstappen, Perez, basically a one-man team. But Ferrari, they're going to have Leclerc Hamilton next year. Mercedes, at the moment, you've got Russell Hamilton. McLaren have got Piastri Norris. Those are two strong drivers. Whereas Aston Martin, they're just relying on Alonso because Stroll can't keep up.
Yeah, I mean, he's got that qualifying deficit, sort of inconsistency in races. I think, yeah, Sainz would be a really good shout, I think, for me. One, obviously, there'd be that good relationship between him and Alonso. And two, Sainz, you basically know what you're going to get with Sainz every weekend. He's very pragmatic in his approach. He's very methodical, and I think he's a good driver for engineers, I think, to speak to. He really seems to care a lot about the technical side of the sport. So I think for a team like Aston Martin, yeah, like you said, he'd be perfect. And Sainz Alonso ticks a lot of boxes, but we say about Lance, he's on a rolling contract. Could he be put in a hypercar Aston Martin Valkyrie project by his father? I really don't see it happening. I think the sort of the talk from Aston Martin never looks like they'll ever get rid of. It will be Lance who decides, which I think is a bit of a shame, really. I mean, I wouldn't say he's not a terrible Grand Prix driver. He's a good Grand Prix driver, but when there's better out there and your team, Lawrence goes on about how he wants to turn Aston Martin into the best team on the grid. It's not going to happen with Lance as one of the drivers. Should we talk about Sauber?
Yes, everyone's favourite perennial underperforming team.
Yes, that's a niche category of Formula One right there. I think they're probably one of one in that category at
Yes.
the moment. They seem to be quite slow. Poor old Bottas was just circling around at the back. Zhou was the recipient of the bad pit stop this week. It was Bottas's turn in Bahrain, Zhou's turn in Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't the best of races for Sauber. Audi are announcing they're going to do a full 100% takeover instead of 75%. But there seems to be a lot of work to do between now and 2026 to get the Hinwil-based team up and running and performing well.
Yeah, it's just a classic example of an independent team being left behind by this era of, manufacturers at the forefront of the sport. Sauber were quite optimistic heading into this year. They revamped their car concept like many others. James Key is technical director, but it just seems like 2024, with the exception of a few teams, 2024 has effectively just been a carryover of last year, and that's where Sauber are. I think Sauber should be extremely worried once Alpine, if Alpine get their act together and these upgrades do transform their fortunes, Sauber could be looking at bringing up the rear of the grid like they did in Saudi Arabia every weekend. And if you don't have the pace on the track, the one thing that you can do is be operationally strong. But yeah, two slow pit stops in 2 weeks is not a good look. You had Joe crashing into the barriers in FP3, which compromised his qualifying. He didn't set a lap and also added to the damage bill.
Yeah, I think, again, Audi will be looking at a lot of things here. It's interesting, obviously, because there's been all that talk of whether Audi have cold feet in Formula One, but this latest move suggests that they don't. They've installed they've displaced a member from the board and plonked them into the Formula One setup to work with Seidel. But from them, you're probably looking at quite a big overhaul of the driver lineup, technical team, perhaps. There's a lot of things that need doing before that team is ready to be something that Audi are proud of, because Audi like to go and win whatever they do. Obviously, they're going to have to be patient, I think. But it does look like if Alpine get their act together, it looks like Sauber will be finishing 10th. They slipped basically from the halfway point in the 2022 season, didn't they? That second half of that season was poor. 2023 was pretty poor from them, and they seem to be continuing. But yeah, Alpine, right? Well, Ocon was in that DRS train, so there wasn't behind Magnussen. There wasn't really much he could do, but I think he did well to sort of be in that pack, considering the issues with that car. And then Gasly's made it about a lap. I think the technical problems happened at the end of the formation lap, didn't they, with the gearbox? So another bad day at the office for them.
Yeah, but I think once you get Bahrain out the way, obviously they came into the season expected to be poor, and then Bahrain really highlighted how poor it was, and there was that sort of emergence of like, wow, they are really in shambles. You have the changes ahead of Saudi Arabia, Matt Harmon and Dirk De Beer departing the team, new three-pronged structure reminiscent of McLaren's change last year. But yeah, now it's kind of settled into that phase of you don't really expect much from Alpine. This is where they are, and until they get upgrades on the car, this is where they'll continue to be. Ocon capitalised, he said, on that DRS train. Sonoda getting hung up to dry at turn 3 by Magnussen allowed him to slip into 13th place, which is a solid result given the circumstances. And yeah, I mean, that's all. Alpine are just kind of trotting along. Ocon trying to keep spirits high until they do get those upgrades on the car.
Yeah, Ocon definitely seems to be sort of settling into a sort of team leader role from a sort of vocal perspective on the team radio. He seems to be trying, yeah, as you say, keeping things upbeat. which is good, I guess. It's a long season, so he's going to have to do that a lot, I think. But yeah, coming to RB, again, I think Zach Brown will be happy that they're not challenging right at the front and they still remain to be that sort of in that battle for 7th, 8th best placed team. A quiet weekend again from them. Tsunoda obviously getting angry behind Magnussen. Then Ricciardo having a very poor weekend. That little spin at the end just to sort of put the cherry on top of the cake. What did you make of RB? They didn't seem to be very impressive this weekend.
Bit underwhelming because you thought coming into the season with this increased alliance with the Red Bull that they'd be chopping at the heels of the points places, and Tsunoda got into Q3, but he said that the race pace just wasn't there. He felt like he was going to lose the car in the first stint, which is a bit of a worrying assessment. Obviously, the conditions of qualifying, as we saw with Ferrari last year, it could mask deficiencies of the car, whereas the race really highlights and exposes weaknesses. Ricciardo had a really, really dreadful weekend. He said after qualifying he was hoping there was damage on his car because he was about half a second shy of Tsunoda. Second consecutive weekend that Tsunoda's out qualifying him now. And it turns out actually after the race, Ricciardo, he only beat the two Saubers out of the drivers he made at home. And he said actually there was a problem with his car. They noticed that there's flaws in the car on his side, which is really baffling why they didn't then take his car out off the starting grid, out of parc fermé conditions, and allow them to make changes, because at the end of the day, he was 14th. But a damaged car, he's not going to be making progress in the points. So they really had nothing to lose. So it's a bit of a strange one for me that they left him out there if they did have supposed problems. And that spin kind of just characterised this entire weekend. And the fact that it happened right in front of Sergio Perez was quite, quite
ironic.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
I think again with RB as well, obviously we have the benefit of hindsight, and this is kind of what Norris said on the flip side, because Norris and McLaren with the safety car, they tried something different, staying out and seeing if it could play into their hands, and it didn't. You could say from a hindsight perspective from RB, take the car out of parc fermé, fix the issue as you say, start from pit lane, bank on there being a safety car, which there was. He would have vaulted himself up the grid, and then they could have done something similar to Haas. Tsunoda could have been the Magnussen of that situation, and they could have possibly got that final point with Ricciardo if there was that problem that Ricciardo said needed to be fixed. I mean, it's an interesting one with Danny Rick, because obviously we know that he used to be an amazing Grand Prix driver. And ever since it's gone to the ground effect era, he's lost something. Obviously, there was the 22 McLaren wasn't very helpful in that regard. He had his stagnated comeback last year because of the injury he got on Zandvoort. And there's only two races so far this year, but he has been beaten twice in terms of on pace by Tsunoda. Australia is not very representative of a Formula One calendar. It's a quirky track. Suzuka, I think, will be an interesting one. And just when the races really start ticking off, I just hope it's not another season where he's only good at Mexico. That would be a shame, just because of I think everybody likes Daniel Ricciardo.
Yeah, let's put it this way. Let's put it this way. That Ricciardo is literally saving Perez's seat right now, because I think regardless of although Red Bull will say Perez is in pole position, it's his seat to lose. I think from what we gather, it's dependent on how Ricciardo performs. And if Ricciardo has the measure of Tsunoda, he'd be favoured for that seat. But right now, he's not performing, and races like Saudi, regardless of his problems having that spin, it's not a good look. So yeah, as you say, Australia is not really representative, but it's his home track. He'll have a lot of support. Maybe if he has a good weekend there, it'll inspire him going into Suzuka, and he can really get his season up and running.
Yeah, Suzuka and China, I think, will be important races. And yeah, with the Red Bull seat, it definitely looks like they don't. I never see any sort of indication that they want Tsunoda for that seat. I think he's had enough time to prove that he's good enough, and I don't think he has. Yeah, time will tell. So that brings an end to our latest discussion on Motorsport Speak, reviewing the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Looking ahead, there's no Formula 1 this weekend, but we do have the return of the all-electric Formula E with the Sao Paulo E-Prix, And we also have the return of the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship, its second round of the year, for 12 hours of Sebring. So make sure to keep abreast of Motorsport Monday and motorsportweek.com as we cover those races. And make sure to follow us at Motorsport Week on Twitter. Actually, it's called X now. X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, even LinkedIn if you fancy it. Make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. And Taylor, thank you for joining me once again. Goodbye.